Hello, hello, honeys. Welcome back to The Buzz, your Beesness for the week, your updates on all things arts world. I know you may not have asked, but I'll tell you anyway. This has been a pretty good week for me. I finally got a new lease signed, so I feel secure in where I'm going to be living after this month. We had our first rugby meeting / practice yesterday with my team, and it all went beautifully in my opinion. And today I am coming at you live from the History Makerspace, which is the Wisconsin Historical Society's temporary museum space, while our actual history center is in the rebuild process. And even though I'm not necessarily doing National History Day things today, I'm more of what my family calls a poopervisor. It is very nice to be able to be in-house and combine my two passions here, the podcast and the actual historical work. I know you're here for one thing only, however, I do feel the need to remind you that we do have some new things going on. We have remade and relaunched our Patreon, patreon.com/highbrowhoney, in order to provide you with our new paid episodes like the 5-minute musical. Remember, membership for that is only $1 per month, and you get the whole musical every time. We also launched a Substack at highbrowhoneypodcast.substack.com. That's going to be filled with blog posts, educational guides, all sorts of written resources from yours truly. And we remind you of these things, honeys, because we really hope you'll use them as opportunities to provide us with feedback. What would you like to learn more about? What can we do better for you? We're always looking to improve the show, and having your input will help us do that. And now, honeys, we'll go ahead and begin with your headlines. We have 4 quick but notable updates to previous stories to start us off here. The first is that cuts made to NEH grants this year were ruled unlawful by a federal judge. On Wednesday last week, U.S. District Judge Michael H. Simon ruled that the government violated the law when it terminated the previously awarded humanities grants. Simon wrote that, quote, "The United States Constitution exclusively grants the power of the purse to Congress, not the president," end quote, and added, quote, "There is no provision in the Constitution that authorizes the president to enact, to amend, or to repeal statutes," end quote, so the councils are, quote, "likely to succeed on their claim that the withholding of the funds at issue in this case is unconstitutional," end quote. Our sources report that the presiding senior U.S. District Judge, Colleen McMahon, also ultimately decided the same and recommended the funds be held in escrow until a trial can be held. This decision is so significant because it is more or less the end of the lawsuit jointly filed in Oregon's federal district court by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and Oregon Humanities against the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the Department of Government Efficiency for the, quote, "disruption and attempted destruction," end quote, of the former and 56 state and jurisdictional humanities councils. But as Phoebe Stein, president of the Federation of State Humanities Councils, pointed out, this damage is not fixed just because there's a ruling. Quote, "Humanities councils are still operating without their congressionally appropriated funds, and many have already laid off staff and canceled vital programs as a result," end quote. It's unclear at this time what sort of tangible effects this ruling and or potential subsequent trial would have on the situation. Last week also saw Amy Sherald's Transforming Liberty artwork on the cover of The New Yorker after her Smithsonian cancellation. The 2024 portrait of model and performance artist Aurora Bassett appeared on the cover of the August New Yorker days after Sherald canceled the National Portrait Gallery segment of her traveling survey titled American Sublime, part because the gallery refused to show this piece. The NPG maintains its claims that it wanted to replace the artwork with taped visitor reactions to it to contextualize rather than erase the work, but it hasn't escaped any of our sources' notice that the Trump administration said to the New York Times that, inner quotes, "removal of this exhibit is a principled and necessary step," and inner quote, "in restoring the Smithsonian Institution's exhibitions and programming," and all quotes. Sherald told the New Yorker that Transforming Liberty, quote, "challenges who we allow to embody our national symbols and who we erase. Liberty isn't fixed, she transforms, and so must we. This portrait is a confrontation with that truth," end quote. While we of course love the show of support and encouragement for the artist as well as the arts, it is still disappointing that Sherald's unrealized show would have been the first solo presentation of a Black artist at the National Portrait Gallery, but this is the second time Sherald's work has been featured on the cover of The New Yorker this year. Miss Everything, Unsuppressed Deliverance from 2013, was the cover of the March issue. Another reason we're paying attention. At the same time that Sherald's cancellation news was announced, we saw the peak thus far in concern concerns over Trump's efforts to influence exhibitions and programming at the Smithsonian, whose National Museum of American History removed mentions of Trump's 2 impeachments from a display last week. Alarms were raised by the public, so the museum stated it hadn't been pressured to remove the mentions and even finished its updates this week. Writes Hyperallergic, quote, "The updated label added on Friday, August 8th includes comparatively shorter and softer descriptions of the charges that led to the president's double impeachment," end quote. In last week's Beesness episode, we covered how the Art Dealers Association of America was not putting on their annual show this year and how that left the Henry Street Settlement, a lower Manhattan social services nonprofit, in financial limbo, but this week we heard more details about the situation. The nonprofit has relied on the ADAA art show of New York City for vital funding for years, but in light of this year's cancellation and discontinued fundraising partnership at large, the organization is in, quote, real-time crisis to try and raise the revenue to make up for the loss of the show, end quote, according to their CEO, David Garza. The settlement has launched an Open Doors initiative as an alternative fundraising campaign. Please check that out if you can. But our sources provided an interesting counter-narrative as well. Some agree that it is time for the association to reassess its programs in the changing art market. Hyperallergic writes, quote, "One ADAA gallerist who spoke on the condition of anonymity after the ADAA asked members not to engage directly with the press said that the art show's main challenge is that there are simply too many fairs," end all quotes. All the same, many see this as a huge loss. Still another anonymous dealer described the event as, quote, "quite a historic convergence of histories and service," end quote, which has been lost in the short term, but hopefully not the long. And finally, for updates this week, we heard that construction at Alligator Alcatraz has been halted, though native heritage still remains at risk. On August 7th, federal judge Kathleen Williams of the District Court for the Southern District of Florida issued a temporary injunction halting all further construction on the notoriously dubbed detention center, ruling in favor of a lawsuit citing the prison's risk to environmental diversity, threatening endangered species like bats and panthers, according to the suit, and Native American heritage. The 10 total Miccosukee villages are located within a 3-mile radius, with the nearest, the Panther Osceola Camp, approximately 1,000 feet from the detention center's boundaries. We wanted to feature this story, honeys, because they deserved a post-fire win, and also, says Hyperallergic, the cause has, quote, notably galvanized artists in and near the region. Among them, Artists for Artists, a Miami-based group hosting workshops and direct actions to, quote, counter state-sponsored dehumanization, end all quotes, along with other community advocates. The lesson here is that protests, especially those including the arts, are effective. We also learned that PBS and NPR face a slow shutdown after losing their federal funding. PBS announced Friday, August 1st, that it would start closing up after being defunded by Congress, ending its almost 6-decade era of producing renowned educational programming, cultural content, and even emergency alerts. Said Patricia Harrison, the corporation's president and CEO, quote, "Despite the extraordinary efforts of millions of Americans who called, wrote, and petitioned Congress to preserve federal funding for CPB, we now face the difficult reality of closing our operations," end quote. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting was signed into law by President Johnson in 1967, and the Trump administration has repeatedly accused NPR and PBS of liberal bias, which they have both repeatedly denied. The plan for now is a phased approach to closure. They informed employees on Friday that most of the staff positions would end with the fiscal year on September 30th, though a small transition team will stay in place until January to finish any remaining work, especially, quote, ensuring continuity for music rights and royalties that remain essential to the public media system, end quote. This is because NPR stations that previously used millions of dollars in federal money to pay music licensing fees will have to renegotiate. A few official updates posted to PBS's social medias on August 6th explained that they have taken on a motto of, quote, defunded, not defeated, end quote, and are, quote, working tirelessly to continue our mission, to continue to put out trusted and valued content each and every single day, end quote. NPR and PBS are asking us all to encourage them, support them wherever and whenever possible, and to help stop the misinformation that PBS is going away. So consider this us doing our part. I'm sure I don't have to explain why this headline is so upsetting and so wild, but the closure is expected to have a profound impact on the journalistic and cultural landscape, especially public radio and TV stations in small communities across the U.S., as the Corporation for Public Broadcasting helps fund hundreds of PBS and and NPR stations. Another unsavory headline from last week, a monument to a Confederate general accused of KKK affiliations will be reinstalled in Washington, D.C. The National Park Service announced on August 4th that the 11-foot-tall monument of Alfred Pike, the only outdoor statue of a Confederate official in the nation's capital when it was toppled by Black Lives Matter protesters in 2020, would be repaired and reinstalled in accordance with the recent and relevant Trump executive orders. The NPS plans their work to be finished by October. Arts News writes, quote, Pike was a revered leader of the local chapter of the Freemasons who lobbied Congress for a public plinth on the condition his likeness be depicted in civilian clothes, not a military outfit. DC officials began calling for the statue's removal in 1992 as accusations arose that Pike had been a chief founder of the post-Civil War KKK, end quote, but local Masons have refuted that. The agency immediately saw criticism and condemnation from politicians as well as racial justice organizers. For example, activist politician and journalist Eugene Puryear, who called the agency's reinstallment of the statue a, quote, disgraceful decision, end quote. She went on to state that, quote, Trump and his aides are seeking to restore these monuments in order to legitimize racism and white supremacy as ideological cover for their efforts to attack many of the historic gains achieved by the Black liberation movement since the 1950s, end quote. It came to our attention as well that the last Mayan rebel stronghold believed lost may have been found. The Balan archaeological project of Mexico said that it had likely rediscovered the long-sought remains of Balan, or the, quote, land of the white jaguar, end quote, which was the final refuge for the Lakandan Chaol people who fled into the Lakandan jungle in 1586 after the capture of their previous capital, Lacamtun, by the Spanish. They endured there for nearly 110 years until the arrival of another Spanish expedition and subsequent invasion. At that point, the area was renamed Nuestra Señora de Dolores, or Our Lady of Sorrows, and was lost to time and obscurity by 1721. A member of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History Chiapas Center specialist, Josué Lozado Toledo, was credited with the find and relied on a combination of GIS technology and the writings of the Spanish friar Diego de Rivas to narrow the search within the protected Montes Azules Biosphere Reserve in present-day Chiapas. He called this the, quote, most arduous field trip I've ever had in my life, end quote. We learned the renowned Perlman collection of modern and impressionist masterworks will be split and gifted to 3 institutions by its overseer, the Henry and Rose Perlman Foundation. LACMA will get 6, the Brooklyn Museum will get 29, and MoMA is scheduled to receive 28, none for Gretchen Wieners. The foundation president, Daniel Edelman, stated, quote, rather than put conditions on the gift that would become limiting in a future that none of us can know, we created a set of guidelines to encourage these 3 institutions to bring these major works to new audiences, allowing them to be seen in different contexts, reuniting our collection's works with one another on a regular basis, and perhaps even inspiring collectors and museums to consider new models for ownership of art, end quote. Last week also saw John Williams debut his first piano concerto at age 93. The 5-time Oscar-winning composer has scored many of the most famous films of our time, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Harry Potter, Jaws, Jurassic Park, but prior to the summer of 2025, he'd never attempted a piano concerto specifically. On July 26th, however, his so-called Concerto for Piano and Orchestra debuted at Tanglewood, the Boston Symphony Orchestra's summer home in Massachusetts. It will be performed again by the New York Philharmonic and the Boston Symphony Orchestras in early 2026. Also last week, the Manhattan DA's office returned over 30 antiquities to Spain, Italy, and Hungary. The office made this announcement in a press release on Wednesday, and the objects, including a marble head showing Alexander the Great as Helios, the sun god, and a 17th century Jesuit manuscript stolen during World War II, were returned this week. The objects came from investigations into several convicted traffickers such as Giacomo Medici, Giovanni Franco Becchina, Robin Sims, Robert Hecht, and Eugene Alexander. And the why we care is, honestly, this office is killing it. The return is the most recent for Alvin Bragg, the DA since 2021, and the Antiquities Trafficking Unit established in 2017 by DA Matthew Bagdonos. The team of Bagdonos, Bragg, and the ATU has, quote, aggressively pursued investigations into antiquities traffickers and collectors, leading to a near constant stream of high-profile seizures and returns, end quote, according to Art News. One of the UK's national galleries is also launching a new citizen advisory panel. The London-based museum wrote in a press release that the about 50 representatives of this new panel initiative, called NG Citizens, will advise the museum on its future policy and direction 2016, they will be chosen via lottery in November, with 20 of them to serve 5 years. Says the London institution, quote, NG Citizens represents a bold step toward public participation, cementing the gallery as a pioneer in audience inclusion and setting a new standard for how national cultural institutions engage with the people they serve, end quote. So this could be really great, or it could be a chance to claim public participation while doing what they want anyway, as the critics think will happen, but let's hope for the better. Our regular sources also drew our attention to the fact that China's private museums may be in crisis. Their attention, in turn, was drawn by the South China Morning Post. But their current state is worrisome here at the start of August, as the Innova Art Museum in Langfang, quote, has been dormant for months, end quote. June saw the closure of both Shenzhen's Jupiter Museum of Art and Qingdao's Tag Art Museum, and the UCCA Center for Contemporary Art, one of the most well-known institutions in China, came under fire in late July for allegedly withholding wages for months amid financial struggles. We care about this unsteady state because these are institutions that provide space and support for arts and artists that are not approved by the leading Communist Party, so this is a loss of access to art that is not state propaganda. Last week also saw a judge rule against a hedge fund billionaire in a complex fraud case linked to loans against works by Hearst, Prince, and Picasso. Disgraced former hedge fund manager Philip Falcone had brought the case against New York-based pawnbroker BLCE over a loan secured by a $6.3 million diamond engagement ring on claims it was quote-unquote wrongfully foreclosed. But the judge here, Lily Frank, ruled in favor of BLCE's counterclaims concerning fraud and breach of contract for other loans secured by valuable artworks in the New York Supreme Court on July 25th. Frank's ruling was mainly made based on the fact that the 4 artworks by Hearst, Prince, and Picasso were held as collateral for BLCE, despite Falcone knowing that they were already secured as collateral for loans given to an LLC of his and which legally held their titles. In his ruling, Frank wrote that Falcone, quote, made multiple misrepresentations on the artwork loans that were clearly intended on their face to induce BLCE to issue the loans that later resulted in substantial financial injury to the defendant, end quote. Falcone, for his part, said things are not as simple as they seem. He likened his pledging of the same collateral to taking out a second loan on a home, denied any deception or fraud, and said he will appeal. After a 7-year renovation process full of hurdles, Harlem's Studio Museum has announced a reopening date of November 15th. The New York institution will celebrate the occasion with a major show centering on the late sculptor, arts worker, activist, and community organizer Tom Lloyd, whose solo exhibition, Electronic Refractions 2, was the first show at the museum in September of 1968, plus a rotating permanent collection and installations created by alumni of the museum's Artist-in-Residence programs. We're celebrating this return, honeys, because the Studio Museum has served as a site dedicated to platforming artists of African descent on local, national, and international scales since its founding. On a more serious note, we learned that a Thai art center has censored an exhibition after quote-unquote pressure from China. The curators of the show at the Bangkok Art and Culture Center, which opened last month, said that some of the works by the participating 10 artists from Hong Kong, Tibet, and the Uyghur diaspora were altered to avoid the risk of, quote, diplomatic tensions between Thailand and China, end quote, in emails to our sources after this news was first reported by Reuters. The pieces in the show, exploring state violence and resistance, were ironically censored because of their references to China's treatment of the Uyghurs and other primarily Muslim ethnic groups. The BACC staff wrote, quote, we are doing everything we can to ensure the exhibition proceeds as planned while taking necessary steps to de-escalate the situation. Rather than removing any artist names from their respective artworks, we will place a black tab over the affected entries, serving as a statement itself and leaving the interpretation open to the public, end quote. According to Reuters and one of the censored artists, a trans-Tibetan artist who goes by the moniker Doc Tenzin, the curators of the exhibition fled the country after officials from the Chinese embassy and Thai police visited the museum. The artist himself said to our sources he, quote, believed the center had done their best to mitigate the situation, end quote. The why we care is best put in the words of Doc Tenzin, quote, when museums are unfairly pressured like BACC has been, people must speak up for the protection of the arts and artists. They must let the powers that be know this is unacceptable. More importantly, they must send a message to censoring governments that these works will be seen, they will be heard, they will be discussed, end quote. And our last story for the day, honeys, centers on 2 galleries' closure announcements. Casman Gallery represented and exhibited artists including Joel Shapiro, Judith Bernstein, and the estates of William Museum and Copley and Jackson Pollock, but will close its doors after 35 years while the owners shift to founding their own gallery, keeping some of that impressive roster, of course. Paul Kasman, the original owner and founder, passed in 2020. Meanwhile, on August 7th, founder Olivier Babin announced in an Instagram post that the Clearing Gallery is ceasing operations and vacating both its New York City and LA spaces, citing, quote, no viable path forward, end quote, for the business after a decade-long run. We noticed this headline, honeys, because they are the latest to shut their doors for good in a wave of gallery closures that has been rolling through the art world in recent months, and which worries us because it may worsen the already strained U.S. art market conditions. As Hyperallergic put it, quote, Blum Gallery in Los Angeles and Venus over Manhattan in New York also announced their shuttering this summer, leaving dozens of workers unemployed and artists without representation amid reports of a slower and more volatile art market, end quote. And that, honeys, is our show for the day. Hope you enjoyed, hope you learned, hope you found something worth investigating on your own. I am going to get back to the poopervising, so take care, hydrate or dihydrate. We'll talk very soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.